Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Yes? I want to begin with a little story from Herodotus. In Book 1, he tells us about the Persian conquest of western Anatolia during the middle of the 6th century BC. After conquering Lydia and Caria, Cyrus's Median general, Harpagus, continued south to Lyssia. And I quote, "When Harpagus led his army into the plain of Xanthos, the Lycians came out to meet him and showed themselves courageous, fighting few against many. But, being beaten and driven into the city, they gathered their wives and children and goods and servants into the Acropolis, and then set the whole Acropolis on fire. Then they swore great oaths to each other, and, sallying out, fell fighting, all the men of Xanthos. Of the Xanthians who claim now to be Lycians, the greater number, all except 80 households, are of foreign descent. These 80 families, as it happened, were away from the city at that time, and thus survived. So Harpagus gained Xanthos, and thereby annexed Lyssia into the Persian Empire as well. It is widely assumed that the 80 families were all in the Yaila, the Turkish term for summer pastures. More explicitly, Yaila has been defined as, and this is a long definition, a place to go for a definite period during the summer for grazing of animals, conducting agricultural practices. I would say archaeological. Conducting agricultural practices, supplying livelihood or even rest, which lies outside of the subsistence boundaries of a village, is usually joint property of a village, and, although far away, is wholly or partially tied to that area with socio-economic connections, or maybe a secondary area added to a village's actual subsistence area. In other words, there is a social and practical symbiosis between a village and its Yaila counterpart. This symbiosis exists today in Lyssia between the major coastal towns of Antalya and Fethiye and the upland pasture regions at the top of the Xanthos River Valley system. The Seki Basin, the first one reached from Fethiye, has an altitude of 1,250 meters above sea level. This and its neighboring plateaus are nestled between high mountains that lead to the Turkish Lake District province of Burdur. Although the summers are hot, the air is dry rather than humid. Many of the summer residents live in Antalya or Fethiye during the winters, using the Yaila as their holiday retreats from the heat, humidity, and invading tourists of the coastal plain. This residential relationship between the coast and Yaila is reflected in settlement names in both regions. For example, villages and quarters around Fethiye share common names with several small settlements in the Seki Plateau itself. Esenkoy has Esenkoy Yaila. There's Patlangic, which is a neighborhood in Fethiye, has Yaila Patlangic. And most tellingly is Kinnik, which is the modern name for Xanthos village, and it has a corresponding Yaila counterpart called Kinnik, which is the first village you get to in the Seki Plateau. The pastoral origin of the Yaila coastal symbiosis may be seen in names like Çobanlar, shepherds, and a Yaila village, Çobanisa. Çaltılar is one typical Yaila village located in the Seki Plateau, with its own lowland equivalent at Çaltı Ozu in the Xanthos Valley. You can see the ancient site right here to the south of the modern village, which is here. The modern village originally was situated at a higher location and consisted of 3 neighborhoods, Çalı, Orta, and Yukarı. Sometime after the 1920s, the villagers gradually started to move downhill to the Juma district to be closer to their fields, and this is where the village today is currently situated. A primary school was built in the upper villages in 1925-26, one of the first to be built in the region, which suggests that the village was prominent at that time. And it may be related to some members of Çaltılar gaining importance in Ankara, in the new Turkish state, and thereby paying homage to their village. Here's what the upper districts look like today from Google Earth, where you can make out some of the enclosure holdings and some of the houses, although now long since abandoned. As for the modern village, the 2009 census reports the population of Çaltılar at 484 people, 235 male and 249 female. The reality is that there are 50 families who live in Çaltılar year-round. These are mostly elderly people, for the families with children live in Antalya and Fethiye, returning to the Yayla for the summer months and swelling the village population. Today, the village sits alongside the D350, which is the main road between Fethiye and Antalya across the mountains. This road has been a major transit route between the coast and the interior of the country for centuries. An Ottoman bridge near the base of Oynoanda reflects one relatively modern crossing point over the river. This is the modern road today. This is the bridge, and I'm the small one with the big hat. Further north, closer to Söğüt, is a Hellenistic watchtower. Even earlier may be an obsidian blade retrieved from our intensive survey of Çaltılar Hoyuk, and which originates in Nenezi Dağı, which is in southern Cappadocia, some 460 kilometers to the northeast. This is one of two major obsidian sources of central Anatolia, and whose products are known to have been exploited at distance from the Epipaleolithic period onwards, and during the Neolithic in particular, when the obsidian was being used by communities throughout Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant. We can't say exactly what date this blade belongs to, but the working of it looks very Aegean, according to our lithic specialist, Tristan Carter. We also don't know if this blade was worked in the Aegean and transported back to Anatolia, or if it reflects Aegean techniques in use in Anatolia. But whichever, this example indicates that this Yayla zone served at least as a conduit, as well as a consumer, between the interior zones of Anatolia and the Aegean for a considerable time. Our interest in Çaltılar developed as a question about the role Lyssia played in relation to Anatolia and the Mediterranean in general, inspired by previous research elsewhere. Lyssia sits at the corner between Anatolia, the Aegean, and the wider Mediterranean at large. As such, it occupies a unique geographical setting between land and sea, for it is a crucial junction between long-distance sea voyages and shorter, more localized journeys, and it is the cornerstone of the landmass of Anatolia, where the mountains reach the sea. For much of its history of occupation, however, Lyssia is a black hole for scholarship. Archaeologically, not agriculturally, archaeologically, the region is best known for its Greco-Roman city-states, especially those named as members of the Roman period Lycian League, like Xanthos, Patara, and Tlos. Anyone who has taken a tour of Lyssia will be familiar with these sites. The League favored a federal means of governance, sharing resources and rotating annually in which city the Senate convened to elect the Lysiarch. And indeed, these sites are major tourist attractions in the region. Prior to this, Lyssia's early Bronze Age has been well documented by Mellink's excavation of the settlement and cemetery at Karataş Semayok near Elmalı, in the next upland over. But from the middle of the Bronze Age to the Classical period, hardly anything is known of the archaeology of Lyssia. Only sporadic soundings and the occasional late Iron Age tomb, such as Kizabel and Karaburun, give us isolated insight into the material culture of Lyssia during the 3rd, 2nd, and early 1st millennia BC. To date, no stratified contexts of these periods have been excavated. So what do we know about Lyssia historically? We first hear about Lyssia possibly in a chronicle of the late 15th century Hittite king Tudaliya II, who lists it, possibly, amongst his West Anatolian enemies forming the Asua coalition. I say it is listed because the list starts with something Uka, and the L, for Luca, is a restored interpretation. But the list ends with Wilusia and Taurowisa, which are generally accepted by scholarship to refer to Ilian and Troy. So scholars have sought a geographical order for the list of names running from south to north, but the list is actually difficult to reconcile geographically, so this is not a completely secure reference. During the 14th century, however, according to the Amarna letters, the Luca people are characterized as commando-style sea raiders of coastal communities. During the 14th century, the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten complained to the king of Lyssia, Cyprus, about raids by pirates conducted on his coastal cities by people from the Luca lands. and Akhenaten accuses the Lycian people of aiding and abetting their endeavors, to which the Lycian king responds that his country too was suffering from Luca raids. The very late 14th century BC Uluburun shipwreck may be another casualty of Luca piracy, although this time much closer to home. We know that the ship sank astonishingly quickly, for a complement of anchors was found in situ. This means that they were not jettisoned by the crew, which otherwise is the first action for any vessel in distress. This implies, possibly, that the crew might have been otherwise occupied, maybe in hand-to-hand combat against a piratical raid. Although the natural dangers of the rocky coastline should not be underestimated, for natural disaster most likely sunk the Gelidonia wreck nearly 2 centuries later. In Egyptian texts pertaining to Ramses II at the end of the 13th century, we learn about soldiers from the Luca lands who fought alongside the Hittites against the Egyptians in the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC. But by the end of the 13th century, Hittite texts speak of Hittite campaigns against the Luca lands. The Luca are also mentioned as one of the peoples who invaded Egypt along with other so-called sea peoples at the very end of the 13th century. The relationship between Luca and Lyssia is first attested by our good friend Herodotus. He states, somewhat colorfully, that the Lycians were from Crete in ancient times, and he talks of a dispute in Crete about the royal power between the sons of Europa, one named Sarpedon and one named Minos. Minos prevailed in this dispute and drove out Sarpedon and his partisans, who, after being driven out, came to the Mylian land in Asia. And Herodotus continues. This is a bit tricky. What is now possessed by the Lycians was in the past Mylian, and the Mylians were then called Ptolemy. While for a while Sarpedon ruled them, and the people were called Termilii, which is the name they had brought with them, and that is still given to the Lycians by their neighbors. But after Lycos, son of Pandion, came from Athens, banished by his brother Aegeus, to join Sarpedon in the land of the Termilii, they came in time to be called Lycians after Lycus. I hope everybody followed that. A multilingual stele from Xanthos in Lycian and Greek has the equivalent of Lucia of the Greek text as Trimus in the Lycian, so we have an onomastic similarity. And as Machteld Mellink has surmised, the Greek custom of calling the classical Termilii as Lycians must have been due to the persistence of Bronze Age and Homeric usage when Greeks began to Hellenize the name Luca into the Greek Lykioi. Thus, by the time of Homer, these people are the Lykioi, or Lycians. In the Trojan War, the Lycians are named as one of the principal allies of the Trojans, led by Sarpedon, a different one to the mythical founder offered by Herodotus, and Glaukos. In the Iliad, the Lycians feature for their aristeia, or warriors' prowess, excellence, and virtue, as is exhibited in the death of their leader Sarpedon. While in the Glaukos episode, in which Glaukos and Diomedes exchange armor, this xenia, or ritualized friendship, bind Greek and Lycian families together, forcing them to refrain from combat with one another. In Homer's epic tale, Apollo is their god. Not only does Glaukos pray to Apollo for strength, but it is Apollo, as you can see here, who rescues and prepares Sarpedon's body for return to and burial in Lyssia. Furthermore, we are told that these Lycians speak Greek, although we know that the Lycian language is related to Luwian, and so an element of myth history license must be assumed. And you're probably wondering why I have this up here. This is actually a Lycian inscription of the 6th century that was discovered at Tlos just a couple of years ago on a tomb. Other social customs must be taken with a degree of interpretive license. And Herodotus, once again, shares a few of the traditions of the Lycians. Their customs are partly Cretan and partly Carian, but they have one which is their own and shared by no other men. They take their names not from their fathers, but from their mothers. And when one is asked by his neighbor who he is, he will say that he is the son of such a mother and rehearse the mothers of his mother. Furthermore, if a female citizen marries a slave, her children are still considered pure-blooded. But if a male citizen, even the most prominent of them, takes an alien wife or concubine, the children are dishonored. We began our investigations at Çaltılar in 2008 as a means of understanding the social and cultural development of Lyssia in these intervening periods, and to assess the role that Lyssia played between Anatolia and the Aegean, given the textual references to the Luca and the Lycians by the Egyptians, Hittites, and Greeks of the Bronze and Iron Ages. Our project is a collaboration between Bristol and Liverpool universities in the UK and Uludağ University in Bursa in Turkey, and it is facilitated by the British Institute at Ankara. Research funding has been provided by the British Academy and the Institute for Aegean Prehistory, as well as our respective universities and several private donors, and Lyssia Wines has very kindly provided us with sponsorship in kind. We have a good time up there. Çaltılar Hoyuk is situated just to the south of the village, so you can just make out the roofs of the village there, and this is the Hoyuk here. The mound itself covers an area of about 3,000 meters squared. As you can see, the area immediately around the mound is very fertile and is used for a diverse range of agricultural produce, including plums, apples, tomato, cucumber, corn, chickpeas, and wheat. The lush and fertile region may also be referred to indirectly in ancient literary sources. Homer tells us that Sarpedon and Glaucus owned fields and vineyards in the Xanthos Valley, and that this contributed to the source of their wealth. The assumed relationship between this Yaila region and the Xanthos Valley encourages us to muse that these lands here may also have contributed to the agrarian wealth of the Lycian heroes. The site was first recorded in 1988 as part of Jim Coulton's Balbora survey, and in 1990 the site and its environs were declared a protected archaeological area. Between 1990 and 2008, the only archaeological activity at the site was the occasional collection of surface finds by staff members of the Fethiye Museum. The village has been very welcoming to us, and before I talk about the results of our archaeological research, I want to note that we have used our summer presence to engage with the local community. Each year, we have held a series of outreach activities, including public presentations on our work and finds, and creating a mock grid to enable the children of the village to participate in intensive survey collection. We've also held more informal conversations with members of the village to find out what they think of our presence and our research, and to ascertain what they hope the results of our research might bring to their village. Namely, they are interested in the potential for economic expansion deriving from tourism and improved infrastructure that such development will necessitate. We've also been renovating the former school buildings of the village, not used for decades, to use as a base for our operations during our field seasons and as a cultural center for the community year-round. The original building is of a traditional construction, and we are in the process of raising funds to restore it using the same techniques. The more modern building we have already restored, largely by reinforcing roof supports and converting it into storage facilities during the winter and an open-plan room with adjacent hygiene facilities for use in the summer. A small visitor center is also being prepared, and none of this would have been possible if it were not for the support of the Mukhtar and residents of Çaltılar, as well as the officials of Fethiye and Muğla province, and especially our private donors, and I am delighted to publicly acknowledge their support. We began with an assessment of the extent of the site itself. Judging by the nature and quantity of visible material in the fields immediately adjacent to the Hoyuk, we observed a sudden drop-off of material to the east and west of the visible mound edges. To the north and south, however, the fields were rich in pottery. Much of the Iron Age material, especially that recovered from lower levels of the mound, appears very worn from water and erosion. This is in contrast particularly to the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age sherds from the same context, suggesting that the later material had been exposed for some time, perhaps washing down from upper levels. It also implies that occupation during the Iron Age may have been less extensive than in earlier periods. We then conducted a topographic survey to map the shape of the Hoyuk itself. Using a total station, we gathered a total of 3,200 individual measurements. This survey revealed a series of cultivation terraces over the surface of the mound. Geophysical survey reinforced our suspicion that the mound has been used for cultivation in the modern era. In the lower terraces, no subsoil activity was detectable, suggesting that the fields had been plowed. On top of the mound, we were able to see a series of east-west oriented former farming terraces. We also conducted an intensive survey overlaying a grid system and doing a systematic total collection of all visible artifacts from a series of 5 by 5 meter squares. In our first year alone, we collected, washed, and processed over 14,000 sherds and recovered almost 400 other finds, including flint blades, querns, slag, and the occasional shotgun casing and donkey shoe. By the end of our 2009 season, these figures had swelled by an additional 18,700 sherds and 580 additional finds, bringing our total to around 33,000 sherds and 1,000 other artifacts. The volume of material from any given square was largely determined by recent post-deposition activities, mostly plowing. For areas that had been plowed recently, had a higher proportion of sherds, although I have to add that molehills also assisted in the process of bringing material to the surface. The overwhelming majority of our pottery dates to the Iron Age, specifically the 10th to the 6th centuries. Most date to the Middle Iron Age and Late Iron Age periods, so roughly the 9th to 6th centuries BC, although some could be proto-geometric, which would indicate at least the 10th century. In addition to the concentric motifs, we also have a group of conical bases, including several high-footed monochrome examples of types often associated elsewhere with proto-geometric contexts. While they appear to post-date the Bronze Age, confirmation of a date early in the Iron Age is reliant upon the future recovery of stratigraphic data. But it is large and highly decorated vessels that characterize our Iron Age assemblage. At this stage, it is very difficult to say much about the majority of our material, for we have no stratified context from which to understand seriations and typologies, or relationships to materials from other regions, or how different spaces within the site were used. At the moment, it appears that many of the sherds that we can associate with the Iron Age come from 4 main geological zones. These zones include the Çaltılar Basin itself, which is characterized by the inclusion of serpentinite, calcareous clays from the region of Elmali, which is the next upland over, or possibly the mountain in between. There is a clay characterized by slate inclusions, which may originate in the western part of Denizli, which is considerably to the north. And there's a fourth group that we cannot yet place into any of the main geological areas. Those wares that we considered macroscopically as local because of their ubiquity and longevity at the site, in fact, fall within all 4 main petrographic groups. Visually, as in with the naked eye, we are unable to distinguish between the clays themselves when looking at the fabrics. This suggests that much of the material that we had originally considered local comes not only from our immediate upland basin, but also regionally, and is related to a geographic koine in affinity with wares produced elsewhere in southwestern Turkey. Further work on the clay manufacturing techniques and technologies are necessary and ongoing as we seek to understand further production choices, firing conditions, and other aspects of pottery production. And we are examining this alongside current potting practices in the region. As a balance to this, we also have a number of clearly imported sherds, and these are particularly interesting. Well, to me. I hope they're going to be interesting to you too. We appear to have material coming from Phrygia, with decorative motifs comparable to the ornate class of buff on brown, which is found at Gordian during the late 8th and early 7th centuries. Our black on red examples may initially imply links further to the east, for the homeland of black on red is often considered to lie in Cyprus and the Near East. Sporadic fine and medium black on red examples have been found at a number of sites in western Anatolia, such as Sardis, Ephesus, and Kalisi-Tepe. Production is more likely to be closer to home, perhaps Rhodes or the Anatolian mainland itself, rather than Cilicia, Cyprus, or the Near East, for the clay does not match those eastern Mediterranean wares. Other clearly imported pottery groups from Çaltılar fit broadly within a Western Anatolian style. For example, we have a notable collection of large, thickly slipped vessels that find similarities to other 8th and 7th century Western Anatolian outputs. Some have a distinctive thick white slip, while others, the slip is a bit more pink, and we have a group of red slip with added white and black, rather than white slip with added red and black. You can feel the textural differences. Each of these are also petrographically discrete, which suggests that several production centers were exporting their wares to Çaltılar, or perhaps the better way to phrase it is that the residents of Çaltılar were importing material from a number of different production centers in western and southwestern Anatolia. Oh, there you go, and some more. We also have what appears to be a piece of Lydian marbled ware, a group produced at Sardis during the 6th century. Our Iron Age imports from Greece include the usual production suspects: Athens, Euboea, Corinth, and East Greece. This example may be from Euboea. It's articulated in a manner reminiscent of Euboean painting techniques, and its surface treatment is very typical of Euboean late geometric, but the biscuit is not quite as clean as one would expect. Our Corinthian is not especially photogenic, as you can see from this example, but it is definitely Corinthian. Our Attic pottery is even less photogenic, and I'm not illustrating it because they're just plain, slightly scrappy body sherds, but they are most definitely Attic. East Greece is also a significant source of decorated pottery at Çaltılar, this example of unknown origin. Whereas this example probably comes from Chios, with its characteristic thick cream slip over a pinkish fabric and the Chian guilloche motif. Our wild goat ware suggests broader Western Anatolian production, although at this stage we cannot pinpoint from exactly where. This piece depicts a possible griffin head with a complex swastika filling ornament. It requires some creativity to fill it in, but that's the complex swastika ornament, 2 of them here, and you can imagine that the other 2 limbs. And then this is the ear of a griffin. It's hard to, when you see it with a picture of a griffin, it makes more sense. But this is very typical of Middle Wild Goat too, which suggests a late 7th century date. Now, this example, which is so important, it shows the outline hind leg and hoof of an animal. And it is notable because silhouette is the common method of depicting animal legs with cloven feet. And I have yet to identify the center that produced this particular style. We also have the usual abundance of late Iron Age drinking wares. They drank a lot in the Iron Age. Little material can be dated to after the middle of the 6th century. These drinking vessels are the latest in our sequence. Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic wares account for less than 1% of the total assemblage, all of those 33,000 sherds. With no classical period wares recovered from the site, Çaltılar's settlement history, as suggested by the pottery, implies that occupation ceased during the middle of the 6th century. This coincides very neatly with the historical date of the Persian annexation of Lyssia. Do you remember the story I began with? This is the interactive part of the lecture. Herodotus' dramatic account of the destruction of Xanthos that led to the Persian annexation of Lyssia. Do you remember those 80 families who were not at Xanthos at the time, but elsewhere, perhaps in the Isla? So my question is, could Çaltılar have been the place where those 80 Xanthian families sought refuge when Harpagus laid siege to Xanthos and conquered Lyssia? What is most striking about our Iron Age assemblage is the imported sherds. We were surprised by the sheer number collected from surface collection alone. I mean, we've not excavated. This is just what happens to be on the surface. And their production origins, from as far as Phrygia and Lydia, all the way to Greece, for a relatively small site on a modest upland plateau. Furthermore, these are often large and elaborately decorated vessels, and it raises an immediate question in my mind. Would you really haul your high-status, imported, large, and heavy pottery all the way from the coast for the summer season in your Yaila village? The status value associated with imported pottery in general has further made us wonder if Çaltılar served a different function during the early 1st millennium BC, rather than just as a summer pastoral residence for coastal dwellers, as it is today. So to consider this further, let's return to our geophysical results. The geophysical surveys conducted in 2008 and 2009 did suggest an area with anomalous features in the northern sector of the site. And speaking of this stone, this is located in the northeastern corner of the site and is the only area of the mound where any significant anomalies were observed. This is due precisely to the way in which the surface of the mound has been plowed, which has caused deep soil lynchets to accumulate. A lynchet is a bank of earth that builds up on the downslope of a plowed field over a long period of time. And the small picture is nevertheless a very clear example from Dundry, which is right on the outskirts of Bristol. Thus, at Çaltılar, the lynchets have accumulated on the southern slopes, which leaves the archaeology closest to the surface at the northern end of the mound. Therefore, the shadows seem to indicate something other than the field system that is otherwise very clearly visible elsewhere in the geophysical results. You can just make out what appears to be an elongated line there, and then this series of something, which may be a rectilinear shape oriented northeast-southwest. These represent a series of stone-built structures of considerable size, including at least one rectilinear building that appears to be about 10 meters by 20 meters in dimension, and what at this stage one might describe possibly as hints of a set of walls. To explore this feature more substantially without excavating, in 2010 we conducted an electrical tomography survey. This method allows vertical slices through the subsoil stratigraphy to a depth of several meters. The system we were using appears to have achieved good results up to a maximum depth of 4 meters. We took an intensive sequence of north-south profiles at 1 meter intervals. In these, the anomaly was clearly visible from the surface of the mound down to a depth of about 2.5 meters, consistently across its whole area. In addition, it should be noted that in this area there are a large number of stones on the surface and also piled up in walls. These results are consistent with this anomaly being the remains of a stone-built structure of considerable size and depth, and it is likely that the walls are preserved to at least 2.5 meters in height. There is, of course, nothing from these surveys to indicate the date of this structure or its function or even its construction technique, except to say that it's made of stone. So what is it? Given that the pottery collected from the survey strongly suggests that occupation at the site ceased around the time of the Persian conquest, whatever these structures are, they are likely to predate the middle of the 6th century. Study of the pottery distribution show extensive late Iron Age pottery accumulations across the mound, although in the greatest densities it's elsewhere. So the dark areas show the greater density, whereas our anomalous region is up there. Now, an electricity pylon is located in the northwestern sector of the mound, and that has most definitely skewed our distribution by the necessary foundation trench that would have been dug for the erection of this feature. Nevertheless, large stone-walled buildings like this tend to be associated with the late Iron Age, or the Archaic period in Greek terms, maybe as early as the 8th century BC, generally speaking. And a temple or a fortification are the two most obvious possibilities. With no sites in Lyssia with well-defined pre-classical strata, we must look further afield for parallels. And this also does not leave us many known options, and I fully acknowledge that what follows are wild speculation for possible parallels. I'm not ashamed to admit it. In terms of dates, most of the structures of this size that are stone-built do not date to before the middle of the 8th century. The inner defense platform of Old Smyrna, for instance, seems to have been laid during the second half of the 8th century. The inner defense platform refers to a great fill of mostly river stones bedded in clay mortar. It was encompassed by a wall built of river stones to a substantial height with a mud brick superstructure. It was encompassed by, Nichols believes that it served as a modest fortress just inside the city, controlling access to the circuit wall and to the defenses to the northeast gate. Although its name, Inner Defense Platform, alludes to a military purpose, It may also be evidence for late geometric temple based upon votive evidence. This part of the site also developed into the principal cult place of the city. It is also during this period that the first ramp was constructed up to the platform. Now, we may have a ramp at Çaltılar, although it's very difficult to say for sure what it is without excavating it. The dimensions of our building seem at this stage to find initial similarity to that of the 7th, 6th century temple at Neandria, which is about 12 meters by 25 meters, with walls that are up to 3 meters wide. Now, Neandria is famous for its use of the Aeolic architectural order, and I'm not suggesting that we consider that the same may be in use here. That would be highly unusual because the order is best associated with Western Anatolian colonial contexts. But my point is that such large-dimensioned rectangular buildings did begin to get constructed during the late Iron Age period. Assos is another such example, at 14 by 30 meters in dimension. I'm pulling out these famous examples not because my study is detailed or my knowledge is sound. On the contrary, I am new to this type of architectural analysis, and these are early days of study. We also have no idea of the construction techniques utilized on our building from which to draw any further conclusions at this stage. And the same can be said for the walls or whatever the ramp-like feature may be. We have no idea what kind of technique they're constructed with, polygonal or other, although polygonal does appear during the late Iron Age period elsewhere in Western Anatolia, such as the Troad at various sites, including Neandria. While we hope to excavate in the future, we have a bit more work to do to contextualize the site in its wider landscape. Next year, we hope to conduct some geomorphological work to determine how the landscape has changed over time. We also plan to conduct a similar collection survey of another site nearby that has evidence of pre-classical occupation in order to establish a long-term comparative understanding of how people moved through and used this landscape. But with the evidence we already possess for Çaltılar, that, during the Iron Age, large, ornately decorated, expensive, and high-status pottery vessels are coming from a variety of destinations near and far, and that there is a substantial stone structure here with walls at least 2.5 meters high, suggests that Çaltılar was no backward mountain village during the Iron Age. Indeed, it is clear now that this region itself, in its pre-classical eras, was something much more significant on the road through Turkey's southwestern land corner that connected the populations of the Mediterranean shores with the kingdoms of Anatolia. I hope to have the opportunity to share the results of our future research with you soon. Thank you very much.